All right, so this is once again Notes Towards a Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling. And this is once again Part 12, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December Declaration toward the Destruction of Democracy. So I believe where we are now is the outset of the third dream that Tiresias has in Act 1, Scene 1 of Aristophanes' The Smile of the Sphinx. And I also believe that we've filled in enough of the interpretive and meta-interpretive analysis and discourse that David provides throughout, various segments of his recounting of the stage design and the way that narrative is conveyed here. To jump right to the outset of this third dream without returning, to his analysis, reading, elaboration, and interpretation of the earlier dreams, and he begins sort of curiously, and we're not as audience members, we're not, at least I'm not, entirely certain, what direction he's going in this. But he returns curiously to Aristotle's analysis in the Poetics, and this is the part of that Poetics that is generally more familiar to literary scholars and historians of Greek culture and ideas than that section of the Poetics that deals with the same, content, that is the story of Oedipus, but that focuses on the play, the Smile of the Sphinx. And he says, David says, one of the reasons that Aristotle, probably paired, these two representations together, beyond the fact that they represent in very different ways, the same story, that is a storytelling, a theatrical storytelling in two different genres of this particular tale within the mythology, the story of Oedipus. Beyond that, he says, beyond the fact that they represent the same story and can be compared and contrasted to one another usefully and sort of moment by moment in terms of the way that they reveal the unfolding, right, of this particular narrative. It is not only because of that, but perhaps because of the way that particularly the deployment of the Greek idea of deduction the syllogismos, the syllogism, and then David refers to his exploration of the syllogistic form, so carefully elaborated in Aristotle's volume on the logic. His exploration of the syllogistic form in that section of his volume, Meditations, in which, the intervening or intermediate figure in his play, right, of play with as poetic form, this logical structure developed, or at least elaborated upon, in Aristotle, in this volume of his titled Meditations, and then he returns to his exploration and reinvention of this form, or perhaps readaptation of the form as he picks it up from Carroll and refers back to Aristotle, and then he points out that in the Sophocles, right, that Aristotle, finds, particularly in the elements of the dialogos, the dialogue, between the characters, right, a model for this deduction, and he David says that it's not difficult, for us to look at Sophocles' version of the story of Oedipus as a kind of proto-detective story, in which Oedipus plays both parts, the part of the detective and the part of the criminal, being found out, and in a certain way, the conflict, that arises between the dual positionality of that role is what makes this particular detective story and all of the elements of the syllogismos, within it, the discoveries that are driven by this kind of, syllogistic logic, make, but played against, right, the affect and emotionality, represented by his suppression in the form of not knowing of this difficult content that he really doesn't want to know or see, right, to see or hear, and so the logic, right, the logical form, right, through which all of this information is revealed, and the roles of the these various messengers is played out against this backdrop of an affect that is in sort of perpetually running away, right from the both the truth of the prophecy and the truth of the various revelations and revelations of information that in these logical kind of presentations, which all turn toward the guilt of the detective, that is Oedipus, and then David points out that the way that this idea of deduction, the syllogismos plays out in tragedy is profoundly different from the way that the syllogismos is undermined, right, as a both rhetorical and plot-driven narrative strategy in comedy, right? And that's in some ways you could say that it's the metaphysics of the undermining of the syllogismos that gives rise to the idea of a comedy of errors, in which either the premises in the logical connections is broken, like the broken Ouroboros, and he gives as an example. So, like, for example, we had discussed earlier, David says, like, imagine a story in which, all of the characters are named Mary. Well, certain problems are going to arise in terms of confusing the actions of the various characters, right? If one character is told or learns that, Mary, performed activity X, Y, and Z, and believes that these actions and the whole realm of feelings, right, that belong to that set of actions, belong to this character Mary, Mary A, but in fact, belong to character Mary, B, then this can create, all kinds of confusion that both, precipitates comedy and drives the comedy of errors, forward in terms of the movements of the plot by creating conflicts that otherwise are unnecessary, given a clarity of the distinction between, Mary X, Mary Y, and Mary Z, so David, explains that the confusion, right, that they could easily be, resolved if a certain amount of clarification, were performed in relationship to the syllogismos. It drives the action forward, whereas one could say in the genre of tragedy, and particularly the way that it's laid out and explored in Sophocles' version of Oedipus, you have just the opposite. You have this set of information, right? That's kind of like the pieces of a puzzle, and the audience, along with the characters in the play, sort of simultaneously, receive the pieces of this puzzle in this collage-like manner. And the narrative itself and the aletheia that belongs to the narrative has to be pieced together or reified, right, on the part of the both the part of the characters, interpreting the story and trying to organize in their minds and memories the actions that occurred first and in what order, and assign, right, the values of the characters, like the roles that they play in relationship to these various deeds and actions, to determine who is who and who is responsible for what, and ultimately, who is responsible for the plague and who is responsible for the breaking of the sacred rites. And so, in a way, you could say that the order that was broken, right, in tragedy, it can't be pieced back together until there's an understanding of the manner in which the pieces of the narrative fit together. And the fitting of the pieces of the narrative together, the work of the detective, right, is performed, simultaneously on the part of the audience and the detective and the other characters in the story. And the glue is precisely, what interests Aristotle in his exploration of logic, right? The glue is the syllogismos, right? And he says that, and this is very interesting because in comedy, under the authority of the muse Thalia, you have, just the opposite. You have, what appears at first to be, a coherence, or a cohesion of interpretation on the part, at least, of whatever character is misinterpreting, right, the nature of the story. And in a comedy of errors, where you have more than one Mary and a confusion about which Mary is which Mary is doing what, or and later, David says, I'll narrate, I'll tell a story involving a Mary, and I'll offer, this story as an example of a certain kind of confusion, but I'll do so in a different way, not a confusion of characters and actions, but a confusion of symbolic significance, and explore that idea, further in a different way, or a different, narrative and rhetorical, dimension, if you like. And but for the purposes here, imagine that the revelation and the details and understanding and the way that, perhaps we can say, like, the reification of the narrative itself, which comes together under the aegis of the syllogismos in tragedy, right? Comes apart, under the it comes apart, right? Under the aegis of the asyllogismos, right? The absence, right, of syllogism in a certain sense, because the confusion, right? The confusion of both the meaning, we could say, of premises, the premise that Mary X, the actions taken, by Mary X, belong to this set of conditions that define, Mary Y, is a misunderstanding, right? So the aletheia that can, the truth or untruth that can belong to the premises in the syllogistic construction of Thalia, right, are undermined, from the outset, by a confusion of objects, named in the world, right? And so that the identification of the signifier with the signified, David says, it is already out of balance, and it's through that means that a large part, of this type of comedy, right, reveals itself to us, and our enjoyment, not only belongs, to the fact that our enjoyment and our experience of pleasure in this comedy not only belongs to the fact that we are not making the error, and we're watching, someone else, like, and then David says, like the way that Freud, points out that there's always this, aggressive, aspect of comedy, and and he says this idea that watching someone slip, may or may not be funny, simply because we're glad that we didn't slip, but watching, your boss, right, someone who has power over you, slip, immediately becomes funny, because the pleasure derived there is a pleasure, experiencing, from the psychological point of view of being controlled, right? This feeling of ascendancy and the granting, right, of a certain power, like or ability that doesn't belong to the agent controlling you. So it's one could say that watching one's boss, slip is a kind of delight, and the rather than pleasure, and that delight results from the removal of this feeling of inferiority or anger at the conditions under which a social inscription of power relationships is undermined in the physical reality of this moment in which the psychological subject who, may have a certain amount of resentment or hostility in relationship to this position of subordination, suddenly feels elevated by this this fact that I wouldn't have slipped down those stairs, and David points out that so the pleasure that we experience in this comedy of errors and misidentification with the elements of the premises under the form of syllogismos that comedy derails through the misidentification of a set of actions and those characters who are responsible for those actions. And he says obviously it needn't only be comedies in which all of the characters are named Mary, but and he says, and we'll of course get to that when we get to the two characters presented in Aristophanes, the Smile of the Sphinx, but particularly the two messengers, Dramatikos and Dramatikos, and how they're eventually identified. But he says that the pleasures not only belong to the fact that we know better than the characters in the comedy, right? And wouldn't have done that, just like in watching our employer or our boss or our commanding officer, that we wouldn't have slipped on that banana peel or those stairs, but precisely because we do also slip on that banana peel as well, and in seeing, right, in seeing our own error and our participation, right, in the rhetorical domain created by the comedy, then, and the revelation of the errors that we made alongside of the errors that were made by the characters misinterpreting the relationships between this Mary's actions and that Mary's identity, that the surprise, right, and it's a very different kind of surprise, David says, than the surprise that exists in the gasping surprise of the anagnoreikos and the peripeteia, right? But this kind of surprise is and a pleasure that results from our own experience of having been misled, that is, deceived. So this is a kind of deception. We're deceived in the very form of comedy, as it leads us in its misorganization of the syllogismos, and we're intended not to be angered, when our deception, the deception that was performed on us, is revealed, but rather it's supposed to produce a kind of pleasure, and that's the pleasure of the movement from having been gullible, right? Having been gullible and having been misled, and suddenly seeing it, and the pleasure of that revelation itself, and the light of that revelation, and the ultimate truth of our own fallibility, but our ability to recover from it, David says, is perhaps the profoundest pleasure that this particular form offers, and of course he says that, and that's very different, from what Aristotle claims about the feelings of cathartic release that are the profoundest aspect of the affect involved in tragedy, and then David goes on and explains, in great detail, using Freud and using, interestingly, using, a lot of different aspects of Freud, from his idea of, the justification of dream as wish fulfillment fantasy versus, one could say, repressed anxiety, right, emerging into consciousness as a means of self-understanding, right, which he's talked about, elsewhere. But he utilizes that, and then he utilizes, Freud's notion of, the inherent aggressive and Freud's construction of the inherently tendentious, elements of a certain kind of joke, and then David, clarifies and underscores and points out the fact that even though in Freud's, understanding of wit and humor and the joke, there's a separation of and sorting of the tendentious and the non-tendentious. David argues that ultimately, Freud's, further, bifurcation of the non-tendentious along this other, binary axis, effectively, right, is effectively an argument that there is no such thing as a, non-tendentious joke or humor, and that that the elements of hostility and conflict that come into this initially identified as non-tendentious form, right, that are represented by one could say repressed internalizations of affect, as opposed to repressed social content regarding relationships to individuals that are not I in the tendentious, sorting of jokes. Effectively, right, represent dimensions of sexuality and hostilities that belong to the internalization of the subject, that is, as a positionality of I or self or ego or however one wants to articulate this notion of the individual as the individual, understands themselves in relationship to the contents of desire and David, and we won't follow him further here, but expresses this idea of desire and the opposite of desire, right? Desire and or distaste, or but simply leaves it in this negative form, and refers us back to his talk on Kathy Acker and his take on Lacan, who he mentions here, who he misidentifies as Jean-Paul Sartre in his in his discourse on Kathy Acker. The discourse, he says, that in which he doesn't focus explicitly on the rhetorical fiction and the discursive domain that's generated by her metafictional framing of herself as a student of Herbert Marcuse. So he opens with all of that, and then he points to this third dream, and he says, well, we're going to see the way that this differences in the way that the syllogismos is handled, play out, particularly play out in in Aristophanes' handling of the messengers, right? And how different his handling of that knowledge and information that we receive from the messengers is than the way that it's handled in the Sophocles. He says, but what's interesting about this third, and he says, and it's precisely interesting, and then that was a book in our space-time falling over, not in David Antin's space-time, and so that that noise shouldn't be interpreted as something that belongs to David's discourse, but rather as an accident that belongs to this diegesis in which we are narrating David Antin's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of the Aristophanes. And I can pick it up. Let's see if I can pick it up while continuing to narrate pretty well. And continuing to narrate and continuing to film, simultaneously, and I seem to be able to do that without too much trouble. But had I not been able to do that, I could have continued to narrate and move the camera and to the position of the book and picked it up and maybe done something with the image, and then returned to filming and narrating David Antin's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of this particular moment in Scene 1, Act 1 of Aristophanes, the Smile of the Sphinx. So David, goes on a little bit more and talks about syllogism and deduction in Aristotle and the idea of logic and how that comes apart in different ways. But and then he turns to this third dream and discusses it in different terms. The way that in this third dream, perhaps because there is no dialogos, there is no dialogue. It's this third dream is the only one and David points this out and underscores this fact, in which neither any of the figures or characters in the dream itself that's being retold, right? Retold on the part of Tiresias. He says he, and then he says she, and we always correct him and say they. That they neither in this third dream, neither any of the characters internal to Tiresias' dream, nor does Tiresias himself speak, or address Diarmenia. And Diarmenia, does respond, but she responds, outside of the representation as it occurs on stage, and David underscores, the significance of this in terms of the rhetorical strategy of representing the meaning, right, of the relationship between the first dream and the second dream in silence through the dramaturgical apparatus of the stagecraft and the symbolism of the stagecraft in this silence, and so he very carefully delineate, David very carefully delineates what the way that the stage appears in the representation of Tiresias' third dream, and how, right, how these symbols, unfold a certain kind of understanding that that relates to the way that elements, right, are brought together and reified in a manner that, if not constructing, a narrative out of the various elements, right, symbolic elements represented on stage, if not constructing a narrative itself that belongs to, and then he says, in this sense, we can use narrative in the conventional way. Let's just use the word story, he says. So that in this scene, it's not so much, a story that's developed in terms of, a sequence of actions that occur one after the other, but it's a constellation of ideas that we reify, that we're able to reify because we understand the symbolic value of each one of the symbols. And so he says, so let's examine then the way that this third dream of Tiresias is presented on the Greek comic stage, and he begins by describing. So it begins, once again, in darkness, and then we see this glow, and it becomes brighter and brighter, and you realize that it's it seems to be a mouth that's glowing, that there's a teeth and lips and the suggestion of a smile, and as this mouth that's configured into the shape of a smile. And then David points out, and this dream, this third dream, is it's from this third dream, David says that Aristophanes, derives the title of this version of Oedipus, and this smile that somehow, and David says, when we've lost this technology and we don't know how the Greeks did it, we don't know how Aristophanes produced this glowing smile on the stage, or how the actor or the actress, playing this part, utilize technology, to what techne, what techne or technoi, was utilized, to produce this glowing smile. But David says, but nevertheless, and it wasn't Greek fire. Certainly wasn't Greek fire. I mean, that we can exclude that idea, but David suggests that he offers a number of theoretical possibilities, because of his knowledge of physics and science, and his historical knowledge of what kinds of chemistry might have been available to the Greeks to produce this effect. But we'll elide and omit that in this discussion. We once again don't have time. But he says that we gradually we see that it's a smile, and it's glowing in it, and it's the only thing that we can see on the stage, and it's this little smile that increases, and as it increases, he says that we see that it's the face of the Sphinx, and he says we might not be able to recognize, her today, and as easily as a Greek would, but any Greek would have recognized, very quickly, like that this woman's face is this face of this figure, the Sphinx, who guards the polis of Thebes in a certain sense, but also acts as the destroyer, of those who travel its roads and engage in commerce, right? And the caduceus, David points out, as a symbol of commerce, sometimes confused with the symbol of medicine, that is, perhaps, better represented by Asclepius' wand, as a symbol of commerce. She is in some way, the destroyer, right, of those opportunities and of trade and travel, that might in some sense be represented by the caduceus. So an interesting, reference, perhaps there, and then following the audience's ability to discern in her features, the identity, right? We talked about the way that identity is that the confusion of identity and actions belonging to one identity with another is the way that the deduction is undermined in comedy. But here, right, here the identity of the Sphinx is provided, through the light, right, and revelation that is allowed by this curious smile, and as the smile, broadens and increases, the light, increases along with it, and we're able to see that we're able to see her form in its entirety, and we're able to see, and admire, admire the grace and elegance, with which she holds herself, this winged, lioness, with the beautiful face of a kind of noble prophetess, sitting so elegantly and gracefully and so poised and in such balance upon what appears to be this huge omphalos, right? And then David talks about the omphalos and narrates some of the stories of the founding of the Sibylline Oracle at Delphi, and how this symbol relates to those stories and those histories, and we'll omit most of that discussion and a light over it, and then he says, and we see that she's holding and that she's tossing between her left hand and her right hand an object, David says, which is neither a staff, which is neither a walking staff, such as the one carried by Tiresias in those sections of scene 1, Act 1, in which Tiresias it lies outside the dream. Nor is this object a caduceus, which we see Tiresias holding in their actions, within the dream, which David points out had been the source of light, right, within the other two segments of the dream, at least in parts of those segments of those dreams had been a light source, and that light source is now replaced by the mouth, the smiling mouth of the Sphinx, who is tossing this object that he's yet to identify, but that we if we were in the audience, we would know what it is already. But David is in a sense, David's narration and the rhetoric that he's using to narrate and his withholding, right, his deceptive, in a certain sense, withholding of information from us and going back and reminding us, of this information that he's already conveyed. So in a way, kind of performing a type of narrational analepsis, in a way, is deceiving us, in terms of what we would see if we were members of the audience, because we would be able to identify this object, and if we were Greeks, at least, and David would say this, if he were narrating this part, he would say this. If we were Greeks, at least, we would understand the meanings of these objects and their symbolic importance and value, and how that this object is, in a certain sense, collaged together from these aspects that have certain meanings, and that take on collage-like, right, meanings, as they're presented, collaged or montaged or pieced together, in this symbolic representation that brings these values, these signs together in a way that we haven't seen them before, and not as a relationship, not as a relationship, to the unfolding of actions, within this structure of plot, that, whether we want to call it a mythos or a fabula or whatever we want to call it, right? But as they exist simultaneously on stage as the visual representation of a means, right? Of a means of interpreting what we understand to be the elements of plot that we've seen so far and that we've pieced together so far, and what we anticipate the remainder of the plot to be, knowing the story, right? Knowing the background of the story. As good Greeks, we know the story of Oedipus already, and we're really eager to see the way that it's put together as a kind of collage, he says. So he says, so he provides this kind of expectation, and we're waiting, and anticipating this anticipation of what is it? What is the object? What is the object that the Sphinx is tossing back and forth and in her between her left and right hand, and what does it mean? And David finally tells us. He says, and what we see, that she's, tossing back and forth is neither a caduceus and a representation of, our understanding of its significance and relevance to the idea of prophet and seeing, right, and the visionary, as well as like this the symbolism of movement and travel and trade and messenger, the idea of the messenger, like, because it belongs to Hermes, right? He says not that, and it's not the walking stick either. It's not the walking stick that we associate with Oedipus on the road, perhaps, or with the riddle of the Sphinx itself, or with Tiresias and his blindness and his need, right, to carry his staff because of his blindness and all of that anagnoreikos and revelation, that we saw in the first two dreams, and that he could have used that staff, right, to separate the two snakes, but he failed to do so because he was blinded by the beauty, the scopophilic beauty of the caduceus. He says, so what is it? So what is it? And then he says, well, what it is. David says, well, what it is it's a labrys. He says that what it is a labrys that she's tossing, back and forth, from her left to her right hand, and she's tossing it back and forth in this manner in which you can hear its movement as it cuts the air, and it's kind of like a metronome. So it's kind of like it's keeping time, and it's shifting, and you wonder, like, well, what does it mean? And does it mean like that things shift from left to right? And if they shift from left to right, is it saying something about the politics in Thebes or Corinth? Or maybe, you know, and in the future, you know, if we saw this represented in 2020, or right before the election in 2024, you know, what would we think? What would we think about it in terms of the plague of the COVID virus, or what would we think about it in terms of the rise of fascism, you know, in the United States, and this movement of this metronome, like, you know, or maybe it represents time. Does it represent time because it's ticking away? And then he says, well, you know, like, you know, for a Greek, that representation, well, he says, for a Greek, you know, the representation of time would have probably been different. It would have involved a shadow, you know, cast perhaps by a sundial. But he says, you know, let's imagine that there were, you know, chronometers and of different kinds, that there were perhaps water clocks, or that maybe some adventurer like Jason or like Odysseus, you know, picked up. Maybe Odysseus picked up one of these things on his way home to Ithaca, you know, from Troy, and or some other, you know, form of chronological, you know, timekeeping device in which tempo, you know, played a part, you know, just like it does with our grandfather clocks, and this ticking, you know, back and forth of this pendulum, and the pendulum, you know, and then he goes on about pendulums, and, you know, makes reference to you know, various kinds of pendulums in various you know, fictions and stories and tellings, including you know, the pendulum as it's represented in that tale, you know, David and Lisa, and also the pendulum as it, you know, is represented by in the Pit and the Pendulum, you know, by Edgar Allan Poe, and he talks about the way that you know, our understanding of these pendulums, you know, might represent, you know, different understandings in relationship to time, mortality, and also, you know, this idea of a kind of like swinging back and forth, like and he makes reference to swinging back and forth, you know. It's not really a dialectical idea. It's almost like the ruin of a dialectical idea, and because a dialectical idea, David, you know, points out and underscores, you know, moves things forward rather than just, you know, swings, you know, back and forth, and he points, you know, to a contemporary, you know, art critic of his, contemporaneous with himself, Donald Cuspit, and he says, like, in Donald Cuspit, you have this idea of like this kind of a pendulum, like that just goes back and forth, and so you get like you get hard edge over here, and then it goes back, you know, and then you get head, and then you get expressionism over here, and then you get, you know, like, you know, social concern over here, and then it goes back to, like, you know, purely abstract aesthetics over here, and then you go over here, and then this is a Dionysian, and then you go back over here, and this is the Apollonian, and then you go back over here, and this is you know, and you go, you know, on and on and on, back and forth, but basically, like, with this idea of like this you know, it's like an exhaustion theory of art history, right? David says it's an exhaustion theory of art history where you feel like you reached a dead end on this side of your Labrys, or on your left hand, and so you have to throw it back over to your right hand, and it's a kind of like dead end renewal theory of this pendicular like set of oppositions that don't really, you know, move you forward too much, but perhaps move you forward in a kind of Dabrowskian way, right? And David goes on and talks about like this idea in Dabrowski, like the psychologist, who defines gifted learning in terms of emotional crisis and kind of disequilibrium, equilibrium effect. And he goes on and talks about that, and then relates it to Donald Cuspitt's idea of this kind of like swing backward and forward. One could say, in the artist affective relationship, between, these types of opposition. And then David doesn't, articulate what all of the modalities of opposition could be, right, in this like Wolflian way, or whatever, which you could do, but he doesn't articulate, like, okay, so one opposition would be like, form versus content, or whatever. One opposition could be, expression versus, definition. He doesn't do that, but he does, give us options for interpreting the way that the movement of this labrys, from left to right, in the hands of the Sphinx, could be interpreted and could be, taken out of context and brought, to our own, contemporary understanding and elaborated, in various ways across various, domains, right, of social understanding. All right, so and then he says, but it's not just a, he says, it's not just a labrys. It's not just any ordinary old Cretan labrys, right? And I almost said labrys. I almost said labyrinth and made a paratactical. Paratactical is another one. I've just produced two of them in a row, but I almost made a parapraxis, an error of parapraxis, saying labyrinth. Of course, labyrinth is a word that derived from this word labrys. And labrys, if David says, if you don't know what a labrys is, well, you're not a very good Greek, But he says, but a labrys is a double-bladed axe. An axe, a sacred, and symbolic, axe with two blades, and he says, but this particular labrys, from which we derive, the word labyrinth, this particular labrys is interesting and unique the way that it's presented on the stage in Aristophanes, because what it's composed of, he says, is the image of two identical Hecate's wheels. The wheels of Hecate, form the blades of the labrys, right? So there's two wheels. There's two Hecate wheels that form the blades of this labyrinth, and he's moving his hands oddly, in the wrong way. He should be moving them. Let's go back and demonstrate. Like, he should, okay, this side, and then he should go to the other side. It kind of does, but anyway. That as she, so the Sphinx, as she tosses this labrys, between her left and her right hand, she's tossing, the twin blades of the labrys. She's tossing Hecate's wheels, between her left and her right hand. And he goes on, and he talks about, the significance of Hecate's wheels and what they represent in terms of border crossings and the underworld. And he talks a bit about the triple goddess, and he says, what's interesting is that this is a symbol of, he says, this is, so Hecate's wheels is a symbol of the triple goddess, right? But he says, but Hecate, right, as the symbolic figure of the crossroads, is also a symbolic representation of the tripleus amaxitois, right? Because she's there. She's a symbol of the crossroads. And he says in later representations of Hecate and her keys, like further inform like that understanding of her representation of the crossroads as a symbolic representation of she who opens doors and she who passes through doors. And these keys represent, these these border crossings, these ontological border crossings that exist, between underworld and our ordinary, quotidian reality, but also like as figurations of parabasis, right? And this is precisely what we're engaged in all three sets of dreams, is this kind of like weird, transgressive, parabasis that is being performed, as a representation of all these like strange kinds of border crossings, between, dream and reality, between knowing and not knowing, between underworlds and our world, between, the fictionality of the rhetorical apparatus in which the stage is fictionalized, David says, and our actual space-time reality as constituents of the audience, and all of this is going on, and then you have this reference to this labyrinth composed of Hegate's wheels being passed from hand to hand, and through it, symbolically representing the idea of the triple goddess, but also this idea of but also like the way that it's collaged together, bringing, right? And because, we can't forget where we are, we can't forget the fact that we're there, we're there, at the crossroads, at Daulis toward Delphi. And this is where Tiresias is standing. And he's standing there, in a sense, like the way that we're standing in relationship to that chaotic and tumultuous period of time from 2016 to 2024 in the future of our United States, in which a fascist was elected president, and then in his second term, tried to be elected president again, and then when he failed in that election, right? Like, what any good fascist would do. Right? What would any good fascist do if they failed to win an election? Well, they just say, like, I won the election. Let's inspire an insurrection. Well, there's a lot of ways to take power. We don't really need an election, right? And you just keep articulating the fact that you won, whether you lost or not. And then you say, well, who cares about what the ballot says? Because there's this prophet, right? And and his prophet says that I'm going to be the tyrant king, ruler of this former democracy, once called the United States of America, and we didn't even need to count the ballot. The ballot can't tell us the truth, like any good tyrant, and so there we are in this dream, at the Tripleus and Moxitoas, Daulis toward Delphi, coming to terms with our understanding, of the way the symbols, held by the Sphinx, whose smile is the light, revealing to us where we are in the dream. How these symbols relate, both to the role, the Sphinx is playing as a representative of the triple goddess, and of the road itself, the crossroads, right? Through the symbolic features of these elements that are presented on stage, these objects that existed in this moment, and there's time, there's duration for us to see it, but it might as well be a painting in a certain sense. If you could imagine a painting, right, in which an element of the painting, this painting is a flat surface, but not quite. Maybe it's a little bit like a Marcel Duchamp. It's an object. It's an object painting. Or it plays between the distinction that we generally understand between 2 dimensions and 3-dimensional object. And he says, imagine in this painting, like there's a little, like, part of the painting that's, that if you go up to it, and you put your finger on it, and you move it slightly, like there's a little object in front of it, like it's attached to the front of the painting, and you can get this pendulum that's attached to the painting to move. He says, if you can imagine that, like basically, then you have the idea that, you know, this scene is almost two-dimensional, you know, and it exists in time, but it only exists in time in the following ways: that we're watching this labyrinth move from left to right, you know, and back again as a pendulum, you know, whatever that might signify and symbolize, and that the light is increasing. And we notice that the details of the painting unfold in time in a way that they wouldn't ordinarily in a museum or gallery space, because, you know, presumably the light is, but they might if it was a kind of installation piece, right? And installation pieces, you know, David points out, exist in time and duration in a different way than ordinary gallery pieces and two-dimensional objects like conventional painting. But he says you can imagine this painting, right? You can imagine this scene as a kind of painting, you know, in two-dimensional space with a few little additional add-ons, like that. You have to imagine that, you know, this labyrinth, that you can move it. You know, like in miniature golf, like they have some of those holes where the hole is covered up by a log, you know, hanging from a chain or whatever it might be, and someone has to go and swing this thing so that you can get so that when you hit your ball, you know, in miniature golf, you can get it into the hole. Otherwise, you know, you'd never really go to get it in the hole. So you have to play with the time. And he says, so imagine painting this way, and then imagine that there's light unfolding in the gallery, but the light's coming from the painting itself. And so in this sense, it exists in time, but not in exactly, you know, the same way that the unfolding of, or our understanding, right, our abstracted understanding of unfolding of story exists in time, where this event occurs and then it causes this event to occur, because there's nothing really causing any of this, right? There's just this you could say, you know, that the Sphinx is causing the labyrinth to move, you know, from left to right hand. But you understand that it's not really important. What's important is the symbolic value of the movement, right? And you could say that her teeth, and as she smiles, and her mouth, and the smile itself that's generating the light, you could say that, well, the light increases as a result of the fact that she's happy, and her happiness increases, and so she smiles, you know, brighter. Or maybe it's a sardonic or satiric, right, or ironic smile, and then you formulate it in a different way. And you could form the causal relationship between the increase of whatever affect it is that she's expressing, right, whatever affect she's expressing, and the brightness and our ability to see the objects on the stage and interpret what they mean. You could say that there's a causal relationship between that affect and our understanding. But that would be missing the point, he says. Because the point isn't that they exist in this causal relationship, set of causal relations. The point is that they exist in a set of symbolic relations, right? And if you understand the meaning of the symbols on Hecate's wheel, and you understand how they relate to the labyrinth, and you understand how all of that relates to the omphalos, you know, upon which the Sphinx is sitting, then you're conveyed, you know, with the tools, you know, through which you can understand, you know, the first part of the dream and the second part of the dream. And otherwise you really can't. And so it's a different kind of logic, right? And it's not the logic of deduction in the syllogismos, he says, you know, but it's the logic of the unconscious. And it's interesting that it's played out here, and it's comical, he says. But it's also a rhetorical argument, you know, that Aristophanes is making against the syllogismos. David doesn't, you know, stumble over that word like I do. And he says, okay, so then her, you know, her smile increases, you know, and let's not confuse, you know, like the causality of the affect, you know, with what we see, but rather understand like the associative connection made in this collage-like manner, right? That has nothing to do with syllogismos. So he says, so that as her smile increases, you know, then you see Tiresias once again, and you see that they are not holding the caduceus. And they don't need to, because the light's coming from the smile of the Sphinx. And we don't need a caduceus, to brighten our way. But they're not holding the caduceus, with which we may have confused, he says, this symbol of medicine and healing, which is part of the way that he's represented in this piece, right? Because he has to save the Theban city from this plague. And that's an act of healing. But he has to do so through the terms of his prophecy. And in a certain sense, it becomes an economic venture, because he has to take these roads and he has to travel to do so. And ultimately, like he's got to intervene in these potential conflicts. And there's a kind of, economics that relate perhaps, to the larger and more significant meaning of the caduceus. And all the aspects of the prophecy, that of prophecy and visionary, power and thaumaturgia that belong, to the symbol of the caduceus. And he says, but here, it's not the caduceus, and it's not the walking staff either that he has, in either his left or his right hand. And what we see, so we see a new set of symbols, and he says, and so what we see that Tiresias is holding in their hands. And he doesn't specify, whether it's the right or the left hand that's holding either one of these. And maybe that confusion, is important, to our understanding of Tiresias as a sacred hermaphrodite, the confusion of what's right and what's left. But he says, but Tiresias is, and then he uses, whatever pronoun that he uses, and doesn't use, the they that we use. But we'll just say there. But Tiresias is holding in their hand. And because he doesn't say which is right and which is left, again, we'll follow David's lead and say, in one hand, Tiresias is holding the aCiPhtPh wand, the true symbol of medicine. And in the other hand, he's holding the bowl of Hygeia, the symbol of pharmacy that belongs, to this understanding of pharmacy and the pharmakos. And he says, so in this scene, Tiresias is presented, and then he uses whatever pronoun he uses, but we'll just use they, presented, as they understand themselves, as a healer, and with the true symbols, of the healer, not the symbol of the blind one, or even the seer, and the symbols of the blind, the caduceus and the staff, right? He says are complementary, right? Because one represents this kind of visionary, inner seeing. And one represents a tool, to navigate a world in which, one literally, cannot perceive, the objects in front of one's own eyes. And he says, but they're replaced now. And the meaning of their, and the meaning of the replacement becomes clear. When we see that, particularly when we notice that in the aCiPhtPh one, there are no longer two snakes in conflict, but one snake. One snake coiled around the staff that the aCiPhtPh one represents. A single snake, not two. And then he talks about the significance of the bowl of Hygeia, and how it seems to have replaced the broken cantharos. And now the cantharos is no longer on the ground and broken and something to trip over, but is this represented in this healing form that's both associated, right, with a female healer and as it is represented in this bowl-like form, like one could say, formally represents the idea of femininity as well. He talks a little bit about that, and then. So he talks about that we understand, like, the transformation, through the first two dreams into the third dream, the transformation that is represented in this image, as a narrative transformation on the part of Tiresias, both in terms of his own self-understanding and that series of anagnoreikos. I don't know. David would know the plural. I can't figure it out. But that series of not knowings, through which he comes to knowledge of himself and his role, in the future, and his role as healer, and saving, the demos of Thebes, from this impending plague that is a result of the violation of the sacred obligations of Greeks in relationship to these these sets of taboo, and he talks about the way that this is narrative, not only in terms of the coming to understanding, in this, and then he makes reference to the Charles Dickens, a Christmas Carol, visited by these three dreams that change him, right? In this fairy tale like way, like the dreams are like the blue fairy in a certain way, the magic helper. The dreams, the spirits of Christmas past, and present and future that reside over the three different dreams, right, in a certain way, are perform the function of the magical helper in fairy tale, as particularly as that magical helper is constructed in Erfrom and Brutal Bedelheim, but in other examples of narratological theory as well, and David says, but the point here is that it's not a fairy tale, mere story, representation, but narrative in the sense in which I define narrative as a revelation and a transformation of self-understanding, right, and a confrontation, with this encounter of an idea of the self, that's challenged by the emergence, right, of both desire and repression in a certain sense, and the fear, right, of transformation and failure, perhaps, and so he talks about this and how it's all represented in these transformations of the symbols, right, rather than in a plot, or in a dialogue, or even through words and verbalizations, and how that might in some way challenge this idea of storytelling as syllogismos, right, particularly as it's presented in Aristotle's reading of Sophocles, and then from there he moves on to the smile broadening and increasing, and says, and then finally what we see is we see the various members of the chorus, and they're the last thing that we see on the stage. But he says we see the various members of the chorus, but they seem to have changed, and now there are women and men, he says, and these men and women are all of various colors and ethnic backgrounds, and there are some individuals on the stage that seem to have disabilities, like Tiresias. They're either blind or they require or they're sitting down because maybe they can't stand on their own, or they're supported by a fellow. But all of them, and he says, and all of these, different, these varieties, right? David says all of these like varieties of representations of the demos that we didn't see before, and there are some that are clearly like distinguished by their dress in male and traditionally male costumes, and there are some that are distinguished from these by their dress in traditionally female clothing and costumes, and there are some that incorporate both what we would associate with masculine Greek, dress and clothing, and feminine Greek dress and clothing. And so that refer back again, to the notion of the sacred, hermaphroditic. And there are some, and he talks about, the all of the ways in which that the appearance, right, of the chorus representing, this perhaps what he suggests to be, future demos, it seems to be very different, from what we saw, the homogeneous and kind of indistinguishability, that or the hint of sameness, between the various representations of the individual elements of the demos as represented by the chorus in the initial two dreams, right? And he says that David says that each and every one of the individuals playing the parts of the chorus now holds a cornucopia, and then he he refers to the horn of the cornucopia and the story of the horn, and what it represents in terms of bounty, and but also of the care that was provided through the milk of that the cornucopia relates to in various stories, right, which help to define this object, and he associates it with he makes reference to the Orisha Ogu and the horn as it relates to these this African myth of a similar kind of object. And ultimately, frightened, right? Ultimately, frightened citizens, and ultimately frightened citizens of this demos who fear, right? And are poor and can't, right, understand or identify with anything that doesn't conform, to the narrow range of self-understanding, through which they define this very limited set of abstract features that David points out, is largely self-delusional, from the very outset, right? Like that we understand, like that. David says that we understand that, today, that gender is a social construct, and that sexuality is a social construct, and that race, emerged as a constructed fiction, as a narrative, to justify, certain privileges and certain, economies and certain organizations of social existence, and that in the same manner, that normativity and ability and its so-called contrary or binary opposite, disability is equally a construction, and he says so in this combined figure, these combined two figures, which problematize, so many of these constructions in the Sphinx, who problematizes, identity and body and sexuality and threat and what is human, and in the figure of Tiresias, who also problematizes all of these, constructed, social articulations of norm, what Aristophanes effectively, performs is, in this third dream, right, is an articulation of an expansive notion of inclusion, right, in cultural in the cultural terms, under which, a demos as democracy, right, can evolve into a society in which, David says, like, I don't want to be too utopian in my reading of Aristophanes, but can evolve, at least, beyond the confines of the notion of a society, regulated and controlled, but by the ultimate authority of this patriarchal, tyrant, whether that patriarchal tyrant, is takes the form of Elias, right, who Elias, who's willing to kill, his own children, to maintain power, like a figure like that we might associate with Trump, or whether, that tyranny is represented by a figure like Oedipus, who wants to take credit, right, for the healing of the society, even though, he's the one that is, primarily responsible for its sickness, which I guess David says would also be another figure like Trump. And then he laughs. So we're a little out of sync because we don't see him laughing here. But, so he says, both aspects, of Trump as the one that, claims that, he's the savior when he's, and in fact, exactly the opposite of the savior. And the other aspect is this ultimate, tyrant willing to do anything to maintain power, and including, eating, maybe not eating, but at least murdering, his own children, his own family, And you see this, David says, when, anyone who questions, right, like that kind of a tyrant, like it's always, cast out almost immediately. So even if Trump had claimed at one point, this guy, he belongs to my entourage. He's part of my unit. And he's the best whatever. He's the best Secretary of State ever, or he's the best. He's the best vice president we've ever had, or because he supports me, he's the best, just like I'm the best, right? But the minute like the slightest, even the slightest degree of criticism is directed at this kind of tyrant, he'll disown and he'll disavow this one and seek his destruction. And how many, like David points to, using future memory, how many individuals did Trump target, right, as this kind of threat to his existence, just in the same way that Laius attempted to destroy and murder his own son in order to maintain power. How many? And then he makes a list. David makes a list of all of the individuals whose careers and whose future political success Trump tried to destroy, including his own vice president, right? Because he felt dissatisfied with the level, right, of support and adulation that he received from these individuals, and how there was this paranoia, right? Paranoia of disloyalty that we certainly see in Laius as well. So David then he turns back to this this kind of utopian vision of the figure of Tiresias and the transformation that he makes through the course of the three dreams, and then the figure of the demos and the transformation that is made of the demos into a true democracy. and a democracy that never even belonged, to Greek culture, David points out, but that that potentially, can exist for us, as we pass, from 2024 to 2025, in the future, if we follow, the if we follow, what we know to be, the truth of this conjunction, or this conflux of the emergence into, true democracy, and the emergence, from the conditions of sickness into the, conditions of psychological and physical wellness, and then, from there, he goes on, to explore, some of the ways in which, that might actually be accomplished, that those kinds of social transformations might actually be accomplished in the future. But we'll elide that, and then we'll return, to the conclusion of this third dream, and abruptly, to conclude this dream, abruptly, the Sphinx, discontinues smiling. She closes her mouth, and immediately, because her smile is the light source, we can no longer see anything on the stage, and then the stage lights, come up once again, and what we see is just a white screen, David says, in the background, and but what we can see also upon this white screen is, because of the optical effect of the brightness of the Sphinx's smile as light source, we see this crescent moon. We see this crescent moon that was once the Sphinx's smile. This black, crescent moon that seems to represent, Luna or Artemis, and all of the elements of feminine healing that are associated, with this symbol of the crescent. And perhaps, David says you can see a hint of this eight-pointed star that somehow, that eight-pointed star resulted from the glow of that half moon of the Sphinx's smile onto the features of her face, and her somewhat lioness-like nose, he says, and so the audience is sitting there, and they're seeing what's left of the smile as this curved moon, and perhaps, as I said, associated with with figures like Artemis or like Luna, and all of the symbolic meanings that we might find there, and what kind of light what would it mean to be directed by this smile, and the light of this smile as this crescent moon left as an after image. And he explains, and I won't, go into the explanation the way that David does, but he talks about, cones and whatever the other word is, that cones, and I can't remember, but, the optical apparatus that the human eye, possesses, because of exhaustion, right? In seeing certain types of images, both colored and strong light, that these complementary after images emerge as a response to the exhaustion of these various cones and rods, I think it is, that define our ability to see. And he says this, he talks about the physics of it, and how the Greeks were aware of how that worked and could manipulate this. But he says it's still a unique moment in the history of Greek drama, either tragedy or comedy, and for that reason, is a powerfully inventive, discursive domain, just like the inventiveness of playing with your cinematic genre of snake dancing and putting it on a loop, right? That to allow you to exceed the 4 minutes and 33 seconds of docile snake behavior that you're limited to in recording these snake dances, and because, right, it's so powerful and so symbolically evocative, that this form and this mode, like literally your eye, and you could say that the techne of one's own eye, right, functions, and the way that it's manipulated as a stagecraft is a kind of rhetorical rhetoric, directed against the idea of deduction as syllogismos, right, as presented, both in Sophocles and in Aristotle's reading of Sophocles, right, and that is precisely like what the potentiality, like of a discursive domain of deception and illusion, right? Because this is an illusion in a certain way, but it's an illusion that relates to the apparatus, not of cinema, the way that Marcel Duchamp explores it, but the apparatus of a kind of cinema that relates, to the techne of the eye itself and its rods and cones, and how it can be manipulated in stagecraft to create this deception or illusion. But that points back, to what? The very point, that Aristophanes is trying to create, to turn us to and turn us toward, right? As an understanding of our own seeing, and seeing as, and seeing into, and seeing through, and seeing, symbolically toward, right? And David says, and just as this happens, and the audience is sort of, enthralled, with this crescent moon that they're observing as the residual after image of the smile of the Sphinx. We hear, from within our position in the audience, Tiresias' wife, once again, Diarmenia, and this line, that's now familiar to us, from the second dream, Well, she says, I've seen a sphinx without a grin before, David says, she says, but he actually gets it wrong. David, he actually gets it wrong, because what she really says is, well, I've often dreamed of a sphinx without a grin. But David says, well, I've often seen a sphinx without a grin. And then he continues, but I've never seen a grin without a sphinx. And I think I misremembered it as well in following David in my correction of David. But what she really says is this, and excuse my confusion in correcting David and then offering another incorrect recitation or quotation of what the lines actually are in the Smile of the Sphinx. But what she really says is, well, I've often dreamed of a sphinx without a smile, but never before have I dreamed of a smile without a sphinx. And then And that after image, you can't turn that off, David says. Right? So that after image, like the rest of what we see, you can lower the lights and then you can raise them again, and then we have a new scene. But but you can't do anything with that after image. And that after image, David points out, stays with us, through the remainder of this. This is the this is Act 1, Scene 1. And he says, but that after image, and it varies for different members of the audience, he says, depending on their rods and cones. But he says, but that after image stays with us, with most of us, through the remainder of Act 1. And so it's important, to keep that in mind either. And he says finally, as he ends, and he smiles. So we're a little bit off sync if he's not smiling here. But he says, and he laughs. He laughs and he smiles and he brings his hands up to his mouth and he says, and that you can't do in storytelling. That you can't do that in storytelling, right? You can't do that in storytelling, he says, and he laughs. And then at that point, he turns to Scene 2. So we'll take it up from Scene 2, Act 1, when we return. And David's reading is fairly anachronistic, but I think in pointing, or pointing out, right, the visual similarity between the symbol of the horn, as it relates to this Orisha Ogu, and the symbol of the cornucopia, as it's presented here, is perhaps, and this is my reading of David's anachronistic pointing out of the visual similarities, and may not be what he intended, but I read it as perhaps drawing perhaps drawing like the idea of coming to seeing, right? The gift of seeing and the gift of the visionary as seeing, and the gift of augury and prophecy as a form of seeing that certainly played out in the character of Tiresias and his blindness with this symbolic characteristic that belongs to the Orisha Ogu, the gift of hearing, right, as well as drawing together family and community and perhaps also hinting at, because the Orisha Ogu is associated with herds and herding, what will come across later in Aristophanes in telling in the story of the messengers who are also shepherds, right? And herders, right? So perhaps, and in any case, the chorus, all of these, very diverse, members of the chorus are all, each of them, holding these cornucopia, and the cornucopia, David, points out, are filled, with various overflowing, flowers, orchids, and pansies. David points out these beautiful pansies that, flow out of the cornucopia, being held by each of the members of the chorus, onto the floor of the stage, and gather around their feet. David says, and or are fallen and decorated, around their feet, and all of these, different, colors and varieties of pansies, and then he's careful to point out, and each one of their cornucopias is also overflowing with these various colored voting stones. And then David talks about what that means, and he says in ancient Greek democracy voting was performed with stones and the inscription or the assignment, of a particular color with a particular candidate and or particular depending on what you were voting for, right, or a particular selection, he says, and then or inscribed, with a name, or a selection. And so he says, so the demos now, not only do we see the transformation of the representation of the people, le peuple, the public, right, the demos, into they're no longer suffering disease. David says, and they're no longer covered with sores. And he says, if you were going to represent this in the future, and say you were going to represent this in the period of 2021 to 2025, he says, you might do so. You might have utilized masks in the first or second dream, and then now you see these people with little signs, buttons, pins, and it says I voted, maybe, and they're no longer wearing these masks, or if they're wearing these masks, they're wearing them certainly in a more carefree and carefree and socially triumphant, right, manner than they were before, when they seem to be silenced and silenced perhaps not only by the conditions of the plague, he says, called the coronavirus, but also silenced by the conditions generated from the malignant response to the crisis in the social, and these various laws established by fascist politicians, to deny them the opportunity to vote or express themselves as who they are, or to occupy an equal place, carefree of the violence and terror, right, initiated by uncompromising and cruel and unaccepting and